Hi everyone. On Sunday I spoke about Ephesians 5:21 to 6:4 in the subject of love is like doing family life well. At the beginning I commented that this could seem quite narrow because it's mainly about husbands and wives, parents and children, but actually there's much broader issues involved here, and that's what I want to try and look at tonight for our life groups. But first what I'll do is just summarise quickly what I said on Sunday and then talk about how I want to broaden it out. So in Ephesians 5, Paul says to wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, and says the husband is the head of the wife. He says to children, obey your parents. Says to fathers, bring up your children in the instruction of the Lord. Don't exasperate them. And so we see in both of these a relationship in which one party submits to the other. And of course, this is fighting talk in our culture. We live in a culture which is very individualistic, in which one of our highest values is making our own decisions without any influence or pressure from others, our right to do our own thing. We live in a society in which we're very conscious of all kinds of abuses of power and authority, and a society which is very cynical about any kind of authority relationships. And so this doesn't necessarily sit easily with us, and yet it's God's word. It's part of what he inspired for us. Jesus is all over this passage, and we know that he is good. What he brings for us is always good. So we can approach these words with open-mindedness, willing to hear what he has to say to us. So I quickly want to go through 5 points for wives and then 6 for husbands. So wives, be subject to your husbands, or submit to your husbands as to the Lord. So the 5 points are this. First of all, to submit does not mean to be inferior. To submit does not mean we have to submit to abusive behaviour. To submit does not mean mindless obedience, but rather we bring everything that we can contribute and play our part fully. At the core of it, it is accepting limits to our responsibility. For the wife, recognising that God has given a responsibility to lead the family ultimately, and to accept that limit on her as a blessing to release her from unnecessary burden. Now, of course, that can be difficult because within us all there's a desire to stay in control of things, and if we feel things are getting out of control, we will feel uncomfortable. And so in such a situation, if a wife has expressed her concerns about what's happening, but her husband is set on a particular course of action, then there's a call to trust. First of all, to trust her husband. Giving trust is a wonderful way to bring out the best in people, but also to trust in the Lord who gave this responsibility, and he is always good and he is always completely faithful to us. Then from the husband's point of view, to look at what does it mean to be the head, and there are 6 points there. The first is to say it doesn't mean we are superior. We're not the head because we're better in any way, simply because God has made it that way. It's a call to responsibility, to accept the responsibility to lead and protect and guard our families. It's a call to sacrifice, just as Christ gave himself up for the church. It's a call for tenderness. We're to cherish our wives. It's a call to prioritise. We may be distracted or our minds filled with all kinds of things, work, hobbies, etc. But this is a constant priority, not just to our wives, but to our children. It's to fathers that God speaks particularly about bringing up children here. And finally, just like our wives, we need to accept the limits of our responsibility. We are responsible to love our wives, to sacrifice ourselves for them, to cherish them. But we can't make them submit to us. We can't insist that they will respect us. We can't become little dictators. We, having done what is our part, have to trust that God will work in our wives the attitude that he wants. And of course, that's a lot easier for them if we're loving them as Christ loved the church. So to broaden it out, two things. First of all, this principle of authority is not just described in terms of the family in the Bible, but also in broader contexts. Even in Ephesians, it talks about slaves being subject to masters. In the church, it talks about us being subject to the leaders of the church, and as citizens, we are to be subject to the governing authorities. So there's a much broader scope for this principle of submission. And so the first possible area for discussion you might like to look at is, what does this mean for us now in a very pressured situation with COVID, where we are conscious of our government more than we ever have been before. Many of us will be listening daily to what do our leaders have to say, and we may not always be happy with what they have to say. We may have very many concerns about what is happening. So what do these scriptures and these principles have to say to us here? And particular passages that might guide us are Romans 13, 1-8, 1 Timothy 2, 1-2. But then the second broadening out is within the church, to consider not just married people, but single people. Married people, as we heard on Sunday, have a particular privilege, which is to represent Christ and the church. And that's a privilege, but it's also a major responsibility, and it brings many challenges. It's far from easy or straightforward. Single people also have a particular privilege, a different privilege of representing Christ, which is explained in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 25-38, and especially 32-35, which is to model undivided devotion to the Lord, free from those family responsibilities. And so we can say both married people and single people have particular privileges, responsibilities, but with both of them come particular challenges that we may not always really want. And in the church, it's quite possible that married people are tied up in their own situation and don't fully think about single people, and vice versa. So how do we encourage a mutual love and support within our church between married people and single people? I leave that as a second alternative discussion point for you, and hope you have a really good evening. Good night.